what is the historical significance of this site? And the historical significance, I think, is this, that virtually it's a microcosm of the whole history of Iceland. We have evidence of the first settlement, the first houses, the first graveyards, cremation graves, inhumation graves, church, and we can see the whole development of the country in this one site. That's very unusual. A saga is a prose narrative tale from Iceland. All the sagas are Icelandic, and the family sagas, the one that we're using, are about small farmers, small chieftains, and their feuds. Our archaeology sits within a controversy. Within the controversy, the issue has been how to use the sources. And Icelandic archaeologists have tended, not all, have tended not to turn to these texts and to rather ignore them.
There's a bit of a conflict within Icelandic archaeology, and Jesse is on the side that believes that the sagas, at least in part, represent actual people and actual places. And there are people on the other side that think they're just stories.
Personally, I don't believe that the details of the events described actually happened, and probably not a lot of the events described, even the big events, did not happen.
What we're doing is a major excavation that is using these texts from the start to see if perhaps they can cast a better light on the material culture.
Well, you see, the strange paradox about the Icelandic people is that we are all brought up with the view that the sagas are not just literature but historical accounts.
We've used the text also to find our site, and with these texts in hand, they're somewhat like a treasure map, and they've led us to the site.
A place isn't a place or isn't interesting until it has a story connected to it. That's what you're looking for, I suppose.
I think what you find is that the stories give a meaning to the landscape.
Yeah.
So in fact, if one wants to understand the landscape of the country over a period of time, that these stories which are in the sagas take us back 1,000 years. So of course it's important. Also, an archaeologist doesn't want to waste time digging just in any hole in any field. You want to find something that then you can connect to the culture and the society. Iceland was discovered as an uninhabited island in the 9th century. That's in the early part of the Viking Age. Within decades, a migration, the first major migration of Europeans west across the Atlantic started, and 10 to 20,000 people got into small ships and sailed out to Iceland looking for land, looking for a new life. What we have found at Hrísbrú in the Mosfell Valley is the home of a major chieftain's family, and one of the reasons we've gone to this site is that the site is mentioned in 6 of the Icelandic historical and saga writings.
You haven't seen the house. If you come over here, you can sort of see. As you enter, you can either go right into a side room, a gable room, or left into the main hall. Sort of steps down a little bit, they dug it in, and you see the dark black layer on top of the raised, that's the benches. These small stones are the inside of the wall. On the outsides, there's turf, and then the far outside, there's this line of larger stones. So this is a long hall, and there's a long fire in the middle.
It's hard to estimate how many people lived there, at least 20 and perhaps more. Life was somewhat cramped in this building, and yet for the period, for the time, it's a large, magnificent building.
This season we've focused mostly on the internal features of this Viking Age Longhouse.
The key to understanding how space was used in the building is in the minute residues, the organic residues and the minute artifacts that are embedded in the floors. Sometimes the artifact distribution doesn't tell you exactly how the building was used, so I'm hoping that the sediment analysis will be some use.
All of the floor layers from the house get collected into buckets based on a 1 meter grid and brought back here to me where I float them. These floor surfaces are covered in all the black, greasy grime that gets packed into the floor where people were walking on and living on. So all of the charcoal, all of the bones from their fires, things they were eating, stuff that they just dropped, all gets packed into these floors, which is why it's critical that we take such care with them.
We can help determine where people are actually building in this area, in this valley.
It is a glass bead covered with gold foil, I think. And I found it when I was doing flotation.
We have a number of, unusually high number of glass beads found. I think we're up in the 30s now in the number of beads, which I understand is more than have been found in any other longhouse thus far in Iceland.
It's a typical 10th century Viking Age bead. Segmented. It's called double segmented bead. I think it's silver foil on the inside. It's made with wound glass, but with the coating of silver foil on the inside of it.
A very interesting find object from this site is the beads. And the interesting part is that we have so many from one single house. There's more than 20 beads from the house.
This year, what is rather extraordinary are the number of beads, high status beads, some with small gold around them, others with design, and how many of them we find in the house. That means that people who are essentially of a rich social level were losing material, and among the ones they search for, we find the ones they didn't find. This is supposed to be, if we believe the sagas at all, a house of a very important chieftain, and the material finds of all these beads and these goods points to the fact this is exactly what we have come across. Wow! One of the larger objects that we found was a millstone, or a grinding stone. And from this we can see that the stories that we read in the sagas about importing grain and brewing and providing things for feasts and high status goods had to be true. This is very similar to a millstone that we found at Hrísbrú.
Yeah, this is a millstone from an Icelandic lava rock.
You haven't seen our stone yet, but
no,
the stone
it's
in wonderful shape. My guess is it broke before it was used very much. It's very thick. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit bigger than this, mm-hmm. and it looks like it's rather new. But there's a piece that's broken on the bottom.
From the perspective of the finds, we have, in comparison to other settlement sites, up until now, actually a large amount of what would be considered high status materials that were imported from Europe, such as glass beads particularly. And there's just this year 4 glass beads, rather large, that were decorated with sort of eyes on the side of them that, based on our preliminary research, may have actually been from South Asia. It was a wealthier family that lived here, that probably had many attached servants and probably also slaves. We may get insight into that powerful class of chieftains that were living on this site in the 10th and 11th century. It's a 6 by 3 meter church, 2 architectural parts, a nave and a chancel. The chancel was 2 by 2, the nave is 4 by 3. It was surrounded by about 20 burials. Some of them were reburials. At least one was buried underneath the altar and exhumed after the church was abandoned.
You see this right here? It's a surface, and it may be the surface of a grave.
Since this is in the churchyard, we'll be looking for pits intruding into it that would be grave pits.
This is part of a graveyard associated with the church that was over at this part of the site. And in previous seasons, we found graves. There was one right in this area that's been backfilled, and there was another that was emptied earlier. And just last week, we found one right here.
The first burial we uncovered was a homicide victim, a person who had an axe wound in the side of his head that would have been immediately fatal. It would have cut through all sorts of blood vessels, and then the back of his head was chopped off. People talk about violence in the sagas, and we have evidence that the people during saga times were violent. In Egil's saga, it says that when this church was taken down, that then burials were moved from here to Mosfell, from Riesbro to Mosfell, and so that was one of the things that we wanted to explore. And there's a few cases where it's pretty clear that there are empty graves that were emptied.
I think that it was common practice in the time period that we're working in to actually remove the remains of an individual years after they've been buried and put them in another place. So it's possible that was the situation here.
These reburials, we think it's possible that those are pagan burials that were buried in pagan graves and then taken to the church and reburied, and there were, under certain conditions, a person could be posthumously converted to Christianity, kind of like the Mormons in the United States.
And under altarstaden, under the altar, thou funtes mannabein, men's bones were found. Thou voru miklu meiri og annarra manna bein, and they were much larger than the bones of other men. Þykist menn það vita að sök gamall manna, and men think they understand from the speech of older men, að mundi vera hafa bein Egils, that these were the bones of Egil. And these bones were then moved from the empty shaft, according to the saga.
It looks like it's what has happened at Riesbro is matching pretty closely with what we are told in the sagas.
Crucial for our excavation has been the saga description in Egil's saga. Egil Skallagrimsson was one of the great warrior poets of Iceland, and there's a whole saga devoted to him. At the end of his life, he was buried at Riesbro in the Mosfell Valley.
And Egil was here in his old age.
They found a tomb here that might have been actually contained Egil himself.
For us who are brought up with reading the sagas and treating them as the final truth about the people who lived here in Iceland, it's of course fascinating.
If they ever do find anything related to Egil Skallagrimsson, that'll be something.
Under the altar at the church at Riesbro, where we have found an empty grave, one that was completely empty during the medieval period, and the sagas told us that Egil had originally been buried under the altar and that his grave was moved. It's an interesting indication that perhaps there might be some truth in this saga.
Egil's saga helps in that it says that there was a church at Riesbro which was moved to Mosfell, and that the bodies that were buried there were taken out of the ground after the land was deconsecrated and then moved over to the other church.
The question is often asked, did Egil really live? It's something I can't answer, but logically, one thinks about it, did the Icelanders, just several generations early, need to invent a man who was a Viking, who lived in Iceland, who came from a Norwegian family, who went abroad, who killed people, who made poetry? In other words, it all fits in the society. There's no way we're ever going to guarantee this man existed, but his story is very plausible.
Where do you think we are now, given the excavations that are underway? Have we come to a point where we can reassess somewhat the sagas?
I don't expect archaeology to prove incidents in the sagas. Scholars used to believe in the sagas prior to, say, 1950, and then it all changed. What's happening now is very important for our understanding of the family sagas. All these excavations will help us understand them in a better way.
How much of the sagas is true, I don't know.
But despite this fictionality, at least in part of the sagas, I don't think archaeology has ever contradicted the general image of the history and the society of Iceland that you can read from these sagas, and that is very interesting.
If the sort of archaeological findings do not contradict what the sagas tell us, then that's confirmation or lack of disconfirmation of what they say.
I think you should use all the information and all the references you can find, and I wouldn't throw out the sagas just because they are sagas. But I wouldn't use it for identifying remains or linking it to one's named person.
We always have to be careful also to treat archaeological excavation and the sagas as different data sets.
The big question, the big sort of task for us is how to use all the data sets together. I mean, the way I see it is that they're not completely separate, but they deal with different materials, obviously. But if it's like any other problem you're trying to solve, if you only look at half the pieces, you're cheating yourself. So, it's like trying to run a race or trying to solve a puzzle with one eye shut.
In Icelandic archaeology, we try to separate the written sources from the excavations, but we can't because there are so much written sources in this excavations has proven that we should take more notice of the sagas, because there are things that we have found here that can only be described in the sagas.
We have worked from the start with the people, with the farm, with the town, and with the National Museum. And in many ways, it's a model of how to integrate a project into the social fabric of a society. One of the things that we came across was a series of plates, most of them either Danish or British manufacture from the late 19th century, the early 20th century. And these were obviously buried at some time by the same family that still owns the land. This brought us into a nice discussion with the family, with the people who live on the farm, who see their history, even their most recent history, involved in the excavation.
Nei, það ekki gaman. Ekki gaman? Nei, kannski 100 ár. Já, það er ekki eldra. Nei, ég held að ekki, kannski. Þetta er ekki frá pappi þín. Nei, og ábyggilega ekki frá afa heldur, sko. Maybe it was some kids that were playing, you said, and knocked down the shelf, and then they were hiding the stuff. That's a good theory.
And all the bottles.
Yeah. It's like, oh shit. Before mom gets home, her favorite dish, throw it in the trench up in the tomb.
It's a project that sits right in the cultural and historical consciousness of this country. The soul, the character of the nation was found in the individuals who are in the sagas, the heroes, the villains, the women, the men, how they got together and how their lives ran.
The Viking times and the heroes from the past have always been cherished very much.
Family sagas, so-called, have been of immense importance to the Icelandic nation, especially during the fight for independence from the Danes.
We're into the research, but we're also into giving something back. Whenever we as archaeologists dig a hole in the ground, somebody's going to be interested in what comes out. And I believe that's the case anywhere you dig a hole in the world. And I think it's important that we understand that we're not the only stakeholders. They're going to want to digest that material in their own way, present it in their own way, and use it for whatever, cultural tourism, for understanding the past, for identity, whatever.
Ég held að þeim Íslendingum þykir mjög vænt þessar sögur og sjálfsagt trúa margir því sem í þeim stendur og því held ég að að Íslendingum þykir mjög merkilegt og gaman af því þegar að koma fram í svona rannsóknum eins og verið að gera á Hrísbrú núna eitthvað sem styður þá við það sem að Íslendingasögurnar að segja og að það svona ég hugsa að þetta svona styrki svona sjálfsmyndar í okkar í þessu samhengi.
Fornleifa uppgreftur sem þessi og víðsvegar um landi, það styrkir rætur okkar vegna þess að það verið að grafa upp það sem við höfum lesið í sögunum og það sem það styrkir sjálfsímynd þjóðarinnar og allt það sem liggur að baki í sögunum að þetta skuli finnast.
Íslendingar eru náttúrulega, þetta lítil þjóð, 300 og eitthvað þúsund manns, þykir nú ekki mikið í hinu alþjóðlega samhengi en ég held að flestir Íslendingar séu mjög stoltir af því og glaðir yfir því að vera Íslendingar og þeim þykir flestum hverjum mjög og hafa mikinn áhuga á því sem hefur verið að gerast á Íslandi í gegnum aldirnar.
Þetta styrkir sjálfsímynd þjóðarinnar og þessa sterku ákveðnu þjóð sem getur lesið í landinu sínu söguna. Þetta er mikilvægt, þetta er jafn mikilvægt fyrir íslensku þjóðina og sjálfsímynd hennar eins og fornminjar á Grikklandi fyrir grísku þjóðina og söguna. Það er akkurat það sama.
I think I was only 11 or 12 when I finally realized that the people that my grandfather and grandmother and their friends were always talking about had died about 1,000 years ago because they were such a living part of the community as people were referring to what they did and where they lived and what had happened to them and so on and so forth. So the sagas have that kind of similar role for us as the plays of Shakespeare or the Old Testament have for the English or for the Jews.
So this is like when archaeology and in Iceland, it does something very important. It comes into the dialogue of this. Is the saga true or is it untrue? Where does our identity lie?
I'm very pleased with the findings made by Jesse because they show. I think he's actually found bones that were probably taken up and moved into the church or close to the church, probably from pagan burials and so on. So he confirms that. He confirms that there was I'm not sure about the place under the altar, whether it was under the altar, but at least, and he confirms that there was a church there. But none of that, to my mind, diminishes my belief in the fact that whoever was writing that was making a point.
The debate about the saga sort of, for me, hinges on sort of two related concepts also. The orality of the sagas and the historicity of the sagas. They're actually two different things, and one depends on the other. So the historicity depends on them being oral.
The same sort of farmers were living on the same sort of land, practicing the same sort of agriculture in basically the same sort of society. Whether the sagas have historical accuracy or not has been a debate that has gone on for almost a century. Normally, it's a debate among scholars. My opinion is this: yes, no, forever, goes on. What we're trying to do is bring in archaeology into this, bring in a real material culture,